Well, thank you very much indeed for the invitation to be with you today. And the last time I had the privilege of addressing this conference, I was introduced by Norman. And so I want to add my tribute to his magnificent work. And I want to honour every memory I have of working with Norman. I worked with him on the Coalition for Marriage. And all I can say is that I can just bear witness to his rock-solid integrity, the sort of integrity that held together truth and grace in absolutely perfect balance. And I also had the privilege on one occasion, quite a lot of years ago now, of being offered hospitality by Nicola and his marvellous family. And as I think of the Wells family, the phrase that springs to my mind inexorably is, "The joy of the Lord is your strength." And I want to pay tribute to that. And of course, as we've already heard today, since its inception back in 1971, the Family Education Trust has worked to tell the truth about and campaign for the protection of the natural family. And as you know all too well, over the last half century, the family has been under terrific attack and unremitting demands for so-called personal and individual freedoms have eroded family freedoms and undermined those bonds that lead to a stable and happy society. And a disastrous series of so-called reforms have assaulted stable family life and especially damaged children. And we now face the most fundamental assault of all: smash heteronormativity. In June 2018, Trent College, an independent school near Nottingham with a Protestant and evangelical Church of England ethos, supposedly, invited Ellie Barnes, leader of Educate and Celebrate, to address the staff. And she encouraged the gathered staff to join her in chanting, "Smash heteronormativity," i.e., smash the idea that families are made up of mother, father, children. Smash the family. And in the ongoing war against the natural family, the current strategy is to exploit children. Use a fictitious theory, gender theory, create a new fictitious class of trans children, but then turn them against their own bodies, turn them against their own parents, the people who usually care for them most in all the world, award them the ultimate victim status, and then that means that nobody, not even their parents, can question their demands. So today, an 11-year-old might arrive home from school in the afternoon and say, "Mum, I'm pansexual and transgender." And to question that child would be viewed as bigoted and regressive. And all too many parents, professionals have been swept along into allowing children and teens to be used as guinea pigs in a vast, untested medical experiment. In an age where there's fury about animal experimentation, some don't blink at the idea of sterilising and mutilating healthy young bodies. And those who protest face ridicule, opposition, even police intervention. Gender ideology is the culmination in the attack on the natural family, and it's a wholesale assault on the most vulnerable members of our society, our children. Now, before I go further, we must, of course, make a distinction between two very different groups. On the one hand, there are a small number of people who genuinely suffer with acute and agonising gender dysphoria, an overwhelming sense of unease with one's own body. On the other hand, there are the activists. Those who struggle with gender dysphoria, who may or may not have transitioned, don't necessarily promote gender ideology. They don't necessarily support what the activists are doing. For example, in the current issue of Family Education Trust Bulletin, some of you may have read the testimony there, written by Debbie Hayton. Now, Debbie writes of being a boy, but desperately wanting to be a girl, and ultimately describes the realization that transition was and is only a palliative attempt to remedy terrible psychological distress. And insists, quote, "We can never change sex," and is utterly opposed to using children as political pawns in the push to promote gender ideology. I quote, "Transsexuals like me look in horror at what looks like a recruitment drive among the very young. Children are victims of this gender ideology, and they're being irredeemably harmed. It is not good enough for politicians and policymakers to sit on the fence and hope it goes away. This trans activist movement operates with a sense of entitlement and impunity. It needs to be stopped. The consequences for those of us standing in its way are profound. Our reputations have been attacked and careers have been blighted, but we speak up because we care about the children," end quote. Now, I've been asked to address this subject this afternoon because the Family Education Trust cares passionately about child protection, and so do I. And we're going to look this afternoon, firstly, at the truth about children, secondly, the lie of gender ideology, thirdly, how gender ideology cheats our children, and then finally, a few words about how to respond. The truth about children. The first basic truth about children is that they are boys or girls. When a baby is born, the first thing you say, is it a boy or a girl? Yes, a tiny number of infants suffer from hormonal or genetic disorders which affect sexual development, but those vanishingly rare exceptions are routinely inflated and exploited by campaigners. I know and you know that children are either boys or girls. And children should be taught about the wonder of the human body, that a male and female, when united, have that wondrous capacity to create new life. And I would give a shout out for the great resources produced by Lovewise to teach children about this in an age-appropriate way. And despite the current cultural onslaught on the beauty of sexual complementarity, it's testimony to the miracle of our creation design, isn't it, that we still see so many great men exercising masculinity for the good of others, and so many great women exercising femininity for the good of others. Masculinity, strong and serving. Femininity, strong and serving. But they are not the same. Second truth about children. Until puberty, children are not sexualized, or shouldn't be, and their natural innocence should be protected. Sigmund Freud wrongly read adult desire backwards into the life of the child and destroyed the notion of childish innocence. And one of the most appalling effects of the sexual revolution has been the spread of the notion that children have the right to sexual expression and pleasure. And then came the insistence that they should be informed of this so-called right by means of explicit sex education from a very young age. But the explicit sharing of information about sex to children, such as that included in much sex education, is itself a form of abuse. The sexual innocence of children should be protected without exception. And then the third basic truth about children is that they believe what you tell them. Little children are by definition childish, immature, gullible, credulous. That makes them beautifully, delightfully trusting, and terrifyingly, heart-stoppingly vulnerable. They need to be protected from exploitation. And most often, the adults who would literally throw themselves under a bus to protect the children are their own parents. Even despite the all-out assault on the family, you still get myriads of mums and dads who, for example, willingly spend night after night after night in hospital beside their own children. They're desperate to protect their children from pain, from sickness, accidents, or abuse. But today, hundreds of thousands of decent parents who would never dream of opening the front door of their house to violent predators, often without realizing it, are missing the fact that by means of peer contagion, social media, activist indoctrination in schools, their own children's minds are being opened to a deception that has the potential to ruin their lives and alienate them from those who love them most. So we have to turn now to the lie of gender ideology. Some nursery schools read the little children a book called The Gender Fairy. And it says, quote, "Only you know whether you are a boy or a girl. Nobody can tell you," end quote. And the author hopes that it will give children the confidence to choose their own gender identity. Now, such books and many others like them are in effect textbooks for gender ideology, but they're fairy stories, and so is gender ideology. So what is it? Well, one LGBT group tells young people, quote, "Everyone has a gender identity. This is the gender that someone feels they are. It might be the same as the gender they were given as a baby, but it might not be. They might feel like they are a different gender, or they might not feel like a boy or a girl," end quote. Did you note there the focus on feeling? Not truth, not science, not reason, feeling. In a therapeutic society, we increasingly find personal feeling trumping all else. But gender ideology is based on 4 false claims, and it's constructed and enforced a false vocabulary. False claim number 1, binary is bad. No, I'm sorry, the human race is made up of male and female people. And the word binary simply means relating to 2. And in fact, when you analyse it, if you look at the LGBT movement, each of those groups is predicated on the basis of binary. Lesbians are women attracts to women, gays, men attracts to men, bisexual attracts to each of both, trans want to live as the other of the 2. All defined by binary difference. Second claim, gender is a spectrum. No, I'm sorry. There are an infinite number of ways, of course, in which we all live out our lives as male and female. We're all different. But that doesn't mean that there are 7 billion different gender identities on this planet. It doesn't negate the fundamental reality that we are either men or women. Third claim, boy, girl, man, woman are just social constructs. Well, again, I'm sorry, these are universal human realities, not just socially constructed identities. Of course, the social roles lived out by men and women vary from place to place, time to time, culture to culture, but sexual differentiation is a biological reality, not just a social construct. Fourthly, we all have this thing called a gender identity, which may be separate from our biological sex. Well, again, I repeat, the way that men and women live out their gender roles will vary from culture to culture, but that doesn't mean that we can each claim this fictitious thing called a gender identity that can be separated from our biological sex. Back in 2016, a comprehensive survey of the scientific evidence published in the New Atlantis discussed over 200 peer-reviewed studies in the biological, psychological, and social sciences, and it concluded, I quote, "The hypothesis that gender identity is an innate fixed property of human beings that is independent of biological sex, that a person might be a man trapped in a woman's body or a woman trapped in a man's body, is not supported by the scientific literature." But in the absence of any scientific evidence, what do? Well, you construct a false vocabulary, because if you control the vocabulary, you control the debate. So let's look at just maybe a couple of phrases. Assigned at birth. Now, this phrase is only ever correctly used in the very small case of infants who are born with a true intersex condition where their genitalia are of ambiguous appearance. That's the only case in which you can correctly use that phrase. Using this phrase for normal, healthy children is utterly ridiculous. It conjures up this picture, doesn't it, of this sinister midwife maliciously and randomly pulling out a random label and sticking it on this innocent infant. The phrase denies the reality of biology. It eliminates the importance of science. It tells us that the physical body is irrelevant to who we really are as human beings. Another slippery phrase, be careful of, transphobia. Well, one anti-bullying charity defines transphobia in this way, quote, "Transphobia is intolerance of gender diversity based around the idea that there are only two sexes, male or female, which you stay in from birth, end quote. That's transphobia. In other words, disagreement with gender theory is equated with intolerance and phobia. And the implication, of course, is that disagreement is hateful, bigoted, and evil. Using the word transphobia in this way is, of course, verbal bullying. It's used to intimidate people who don't agree with gender theory into silence and compliance. What about the word cisgender? Well, this word is used to refer to a non-transgendered person. It's derived from the English preposition cis, C-I-S, meaning on the same side. It implies that if a person has a mind that just so happens to line up with their biological body, they're privileged. Using this term buys into the lie that there is a divide between our biological sex and our so-called gender identity. And of course, it's part of the much bigger, wider narrative that wrongly divides the whole of humanity into oppressor classes or victim classes. And in this case, the privileged class are deemed to be those whose mind and body line up. And then the privileged class are told, but you can't possibly speak into this debate because you don't know what it's like to be on the side of the victim, and thus silencing the majority of people from even being allowed to comment on this particular issue. Don't go along with this. I am not cisgender. I am a woman. And then even the term gender itself. It's been hijacked. Sex is a biological and bodily reality, and gender is the social expression of that bodily reality, but it's often now used to imply that it can be completely separated from bodily reality. In fact, it can mean anything you want it to mean. The truth is, let's just remind ourselves, to be human is to be male or female. Every human is the product of the union of a man and a woman, even if their gametes have been artificially united in a laboratory. And to be male or female is not about just having particular body parts that can be removed. It's written into the DNA of nearly every cell of your body. But this false ideology has been promoted via the law, the education system, the professions, and even in some sections of the church, including to children and teens. So how does gender ideology cheat our children? Well, we just need to think for a few minutes about how children are being exposed to this lie. Activists promoting this ideology have taken control of many institutions, including international bodies, powerful global organizations such as International Planned Parenthood Federation and the United Nations Population Fund, want children in every country on earth to receive comprehensive sexuality education. And this education program tells children that they have the right to express their own sexual orientation and their own gender identity. And over recent years, the United Nations has put pressure on member states to adopt this sexually permissive program. So, for example, the World Health Organization has stated that all children should be informed about gender incongruence by the age of 5. Two important books by a symposium of academics and others have exposed the way that since 2007, when the infamous Yogyakarta principles were framed, activists have managed to infiltrate schools via pressure groups such as Mermaids and Jares in this country, and they've put unremitting pressure on professional bodies to outlaw the previously accepted cautious approach to gender non-conforming children and to embrace the so-called affirmative protocols, including medical intervention. And they've suppressed research into the negative impacts of those affirmative protocols. Now, those are big claims. And on the back of the A5 handout that all of you should have received, if you haven't got one, they'll be available as you go out, there are some resources listed, and it's the top 2 books listed on the list on the back of that you can see afterwards. 2018, a symposium entitled Transgender Children and Young People Born in Your Own Body, and 2019, Inventing Transgender Children and Young People. The evidence is all there for those big claims I just made. 2 very, very important books. But what we need to know this afternoon is that children from about the age of 4 onwards are being told, your sex is assigned at birth, it's not innate or biological. You can choose your own gender identity. That is determined by your feelings and the things that you like. So, for example, if you have a girl body, but you like making things and fixing things, you might really be a boy trapped in your girl body. And if you've got a boy body, but if you like pretty things, you might really be a girl trapped in your boy body. And what's the impact of all that on children? Well, first of all, little children. The fact is that actually from an early age, some very little children do exhibit gender non-conforming behaviour. This has always been the case. And they may behave like the other sex with regard to clothing, playstyles, playmates, interests, and so on. Now, sadly and wrongly in the past, sometimes gender non-conforming boys might have been ostracised or bullied by others. They might have been shamed with terms such as sissy, and a gender non-conforming girl might have been teased as a tomboy. Those children might be unhappy with their birth sex. Some might even assert that they are the other sex and believe that they've been given the wrong body. But you know and I know that there is a totally safe and natural way of dealing with that, and it's simply called puberty. When gender non-conforming children are not encouraged to identify as the opposite sex, the great majority of them, now figures vary between 60 at the very lowest and 90 at the top, but the great majority of them ultimately adjust to their birth sex once puberty has occurred, and that's why in the past the correct protocol was called watchful waiting. But now, in response to activists, there's an increasing tendency to insist that such children should be allowed, if they wish, to, quote, socially transition, adopting the name, pronouns, clothes, hairstyle of the opposite sex, allowing the child to use the toilet, other facilities of the opposite sex, and some children find that they are celebrated and praised for doing this. And when social transition is permitted, the child's dysphoria will almost certainly persist. And that's because those who socially transition almost invariably then demand puberty blockers, thus denying themselves nature's own remedy for dysphoria. And then those who prescribe puberty blockers almost invariably go on to be given cross-sex hormones. Now, there are encouraging signs of pushback on this, aren't there? Really encouraging signs of pushback on this, including the exposure of malpractice at the Tavistock Clinic here in London, the High Court judgment in the Kira Bell case in December 2020, at which the judges ruled that underage children are unlikely ever to understand life-changing impact of puberty blockers. But that's children. What about the impact of gender ideology on adolescents? As well as young children, in recent years, a growing number of adolescents who have not previously demonstrated any gender nonconformity experience what has been described by some as rapid onset gender dysphoria, ROGD. Now, this seems mostly now, but not always, to occur among girls. The number being referred to for gender treatment has increased by, these are the most conservative figures, more than 1,000% in the United States and more than 3,000% here in the UK. And clinics in other Western countries report similar increases. Now, this sometimes seems to come from absolutely nowhere, and parents are bewildered. The first major study of this was conducted back in 2018 by Lisa Lippman. She found that adolescents experiencing ROGD tended to belong either to a group of friends in which multiple or even all members suddenly became transgender identified around the same time, or these adolescents were immersed in social media, or both. And she described this as social contagion. A peer group, either virtual or real, fosters the mutual belief that all of the fairly normal anxieties and angst and griefs of being a teenager are caused by being transgender, and that transition will provide a solution for those fears and anxieties. Now, even a cursory trawl through social media websites such as Tumblr reveals a whole array of heartbreaking posts evidencing deep self-hatred, coupled with a naive confidence that transition will lead to acceptance by peers and internal peace. And one can see the angst and agony of such youngsters shamelessly exploited by commercial providers, such as those marketing products, such as binders, breast binders. And in this environment, young people learn what to say and what to demand from others, especially online. They're told by trans-affirming peers that any adults, particularly parents, who resist their claims or resist their demands are transphobic. There's a sense that the world is divided between us, those who understand trans issues, and them, the enemy, who definitely don't. There's every encouragement to cut ties with biological family and any others who don't endorse the demand for transition. They're told that young people who aren't allowed to transition will almost inevitably commit suicide. Misleading suicide statistics are spread around, and then worried parents are terrified into acquiescence and say, but I want a happy daughter, not a dead son. And there's mutual pressure in these groups to demand hormone treatments. Increasing numbers of girls are binding their breasts. When they start developing, boys may seek to conceal their genitals. Around the age of 16, cross-sex hormones may be given, and over in the States, girls may be able to have a double mastectomy at even a fairly young age. But now, of course, as you know and I know, we are hearing an increasing number of testimonies from so-called desisters. So Sarah, for example, a 19-year-old living in the Midwest of America, between the ages of 14 and 16, Sarah insisted that she be addressed as a boy. She hated her mum for resisting her claims. She accused mum of dead-naming her, calling her by her female name. She was furious that her mum didn't buy her breast binders or allow her to take hormones. She continually posted online about how abusive her family was. But now Sarah realizes, of course, she was never a boy. She was dissatisfied with the stereotypes, expectations, and constraints of being a girl. And she writes, teen girls are taught to hate everything about themselves. None of us can win. Even the thinnest, most clear-skinned, prettiest of girls finds an enemy when she looks in the mirror. And she's so glad now that her mum resisted her demands, but for 2 years she hated her mum. The tragedy is, of course, that so many parents are intimidated in going along with a lie, not least because of blackmail, because of threats of suicide. So over in the United States, as many of you will know, there was a program aired recently, 60 Minutes, which did feature some desisters. And this was a landmark moment, really. I believe one of the first moments that mainstream media in America had even allowed the testimony of sex-change regret desisters. And one of those desisters was Grace. As a 13-year-old, Grace got immersed in Tumblr. She was going through deep depression, profound anxiety. She found refuge in incessant internet usage. Looking back, she describes very clearly how children and young people are told that they will only be truly themselves and truly fulfilled if they find or discover their real, authentic, individual gender identity. And she says they're all being set off on this quest. They have to reach the entirely fictitious and imaginary holy grail of this unique gender identity. Grace describes this as an info hazard, a false claim, but once you get fixated on it, it destroys you. Looking back, she can just see the damage that did to her and to her peers. So generations of young people are not being encouraged to look outwards, secure in their own identity, to explore and discover the fantastic, amazing world all around us. They're trapped on a futile inner quest. Grace describes it as endless rumination, compulsively self-absorbed, endlessly comparing themselves to others on that same quest. So vloggers put up daily video diaries of their transition, and they attract numerous admiring followers who seek to imitate them. Grace describes all of that as a process that actually drives you mad. But she, like countless others, bought the lie that transition would be the solution to all her unhappiness. So Grace took the hormones, she got a double mastectomy, but she ultimately came to realise that she is a woman. Nothing can change that. She's detransitioned. She leads a support group for detransitioners, and she is a powerful voice for truth. Now, women like Grace and Kira Bell go down the path of life-changing treatments and find out too late that they were sold a lie. But children and young people are still being told that lie. A father whose daughter has been caught up in the lie writes, quote, "Transgender ideology is still marching into schools disguised as LGBT acceptance. Kids with perfectly normal confusion about bodies and gender are being dragged onto a conveyor belt of affirmation, blockers, cross-sex hormones and surgery." And there are many, many other tragic accounts. I'd strongly recommend the compelling book written recently by American journalist Abigail Schreier. Plenty of copies, I think, on the bookstall, Irreversible Damage. For children and young people who transition, there are lasting physical, emotional, mental and spiritual harms. Not least for many of them, they might be robbed of their future prospects of motherhood or fatherhood. But they've also been robbed, haven't they, of their need for responsible adults to restrain their immaturity. In what other area would we allow children below the age of consent the freedom to make such life-changing decisions? In what other medical field is self-diagnosis the ground for prescription of medication or referral to radical surgery? And it's a tragedy that many children and young people now are actually denied, robbed, proper diagnosis and treatment of other serious underlying mental health conditions. David Bell, former consultant psychiatrist at the Tavistock and Portman Clinic, writes, quote, "Overburdened child mental health services are stretched to breaking point. Any mention of gender dysphoria results in referral to specialist gender services, but in the process, complex disorders, now filtered through the prism of gender, can be left completely unaddressed. This leads to a damaging foreclosure, shutting down of the ordinary turbulence and confusion of adolescence." In other words, all of those adolescent struggles are just bundled into a package called gender dysphoria and sent off for treatment, as if you can just solve everything that way. So as well as the normal anxieties associated with adolescence, there are an increasing number of youngsters suffering a range of mental health issues, some related, I have to say, to the increasing pornification of our culture. But whatever the issue, youngsters may be assured, especially by online influencers, that transition is the magic fix. It will solve everything. Underlying comorbid conditions are not addressed, but they don't go away, and they're not solved by transition. In fact, they're likely made worse. One study, I think hidden away by the Tavistock Clinic, showed that mental health outcomes for youngsters were worse, not better, after transition. But gender ideology isn't just affecting those children and young people who undergo transition. It's actually cheating all of our children. Stephanie Davis-Arrive, Transgender Trend, writes, "What we've been witnessing is not only a medical experiment on some children, but a psychological experiment on all children's minds." Firstly, children now are being robbed of the security of objective reality and the security of knowing their own identity. Biological sex is the most fundamental physical and natural reality of all. Male-female differences are not merely performances. They're not just random biological accidents, they're integral to our humanity. Manhood and womanhood are good gifts to be respected and valued. And so we sow confusion and ignorance if we tell innocent children that they can't trust the evidence of their own eyes. They can never know if somebody really is a man or really is a woman. Children need security in who they are and who others are. Back in 2017, a primary school in California conducted a transition ceremony for a so-called transgender 5-year-old. The teacher read the class 2 books, I Am Jazz and The Red Crayon, and then a male student, little boy, left the class dressed as a boy and returned a few moments later dressed as a girl. And the teacher introduced their new classmate to the class, explaining that he was now a she, who had a new name, and that all her classmates should address her using the pronouns she and her and by her new name in future. Not surprisingly, some of the girls found that ceremony deeply upsetting and went home, asking their mummies if they were now going to turn into boys, and other boys went home to their parents crying, I don't want to turn into a girl. The dignity of humanity is grounded in the reality that we are embodied beings, but we're teaching children to disrespect the human body, and that's actually to disrespect humanity. Children are growing up in a culture where they are cheated, robbed of a firm knowledge of science and truth, and very often in this case they're taught bad science or no science at all. One Jare's presentation for 11 to 14-year-olds says, quote, it's the brain that tells you whether you're a boy or a girl, and gives an illustration of 2 brains, one with a pink dot and one with a blue dot. It says the brains of trans people are hardwired slightly differently from the majority of the population, end quote. No evidence given because there isn't any. How far does this have to go? Increasingly, young people assume that we have to believe whatever anyone claims about themselves, even with regard to age, race, and, of course, any conceivable sexual or gender orientation. It's wrong and dangerous to tell children that they can and must believe feelings over everything else. Maturity, I would suggest, involves learning not to rely on our feelings. An excellent book by Jonathan Haidt, entitled The Coddling of the American Mind, describes how a generation has been cheated of training in self-control. And sadly, all too many youngsters are frozen in the feeling stage, which does not equip them well for a healthy and well-adjusted adulthood. But there are so many manifold self-contradictions in the lies that are being told. If gender identity really is totally separate from biological sex, why are we telling youngsters that they have to change their bodies to align with their so-called gender identity? It makes no sense at all. But then secondly, children are robbed of relational security. A child is most secure if they're safe in the knowledge that they can trust their parents. But a wedge is driven between a child and his or her parents. If they go to school and they're told, if their mum and dad don't think you can change sex, then mum and dad are wrong at best and immoral and hateful at worst. That destroys family trust. Some teachers have been given guidance saying that if parents aren't sympathetic to their children transitioning, schools should socially transition children without telling the parents, driving a wedge between parents and children. Stonewall is trying to persuade the government that if a parent resists a child's demands for transition, this should be classed as damaging conversion therapy or abusive reparative therapy. Parents in that case could be criminalised for telling the truth to their children. Online influencers coach anxious and confused children to believe that if their parents question the idea of gender transition, they're hateful, bigoted, stupid, the enemy. And many parents are feeling absolutely powerless and think they have no choice but to accede to the demands of their children. But children need boundaries. They need their parents to be parents. They do not need parents to be their best chum, affirming whatever whim takes them. We wouldn't be so stupid as to allow children freedom in any other requests they give: refusal to wear a seatbelt, refusal to brush their teeth, get a tattoo, take illegal drugs into the house. Why surrender on this? In 2019, one American mother described what happened when her 13-year-old daughter announced that she was a transgender male. This child was on the autism spectrum and had had difficulties fitting in with other girls. She heard her talk at school, a school where many other students identified as trans or non-binary, And the mother immediately took her to a gender clinician who said that the family must accept this 13-year-old girl as a male, call her by a boy's name, buy a bind of her, and put her on puberty blockers. The mother was told that questioning this would result in her daughter's suicide. She said, quote, "We parents are ignored and vilified while our children are suffering in the name of inclusivity and acceptance." Another mother in America told how her daughter announced that she was trans after having spent a significant amount of time on the internet. Quote, "Her personality changed almost overnight. She went from being a sweet, loving girl to being a foul-mouthed, hateful, pansexual male. At age 16, my daughter ran away and reported to the Department of Child Services that she felt unsafe living at home because I refused to refer to her with male pronouns. Although the department investigated and found out that she was well cared for, they forced me to meet with a trans-identified person to educate me on these issues. And then shortly after that, the girl was shown by an endocrinologist how to inject herself with testosterone." Mother goes on, quote, "My daughter then ran away to Oregon, where state law allowed her at the age of 17, without my consent or knowledge, to change her name and legal gender in court, undergo a double mastectomy and a radical hysterectomy. My once beautiful daughter," she says, "is now 19 years old, homeless, bearded, in extreme poverty, sterilised, not receiving mental health services, and extremely mentally ill. The level of heartbreak and rage I'm experiencing as a mother is indescribable." So many children are being denied the firm parental boundaries that they need, but then other children are denied even the security that their mother and father may remain their mother and father. They're told maybe their mummy will become their daddy. There are even picture books to prepare children for this eventuality. So My New Mommy is the story of little Violet. And it says, quote, "Life is exciting when you're 4 years old. You're learning new things every day, and things are constantly changing. Violet learns all of these things as she faces the biggest change of her life. Her daddy is about to become a mommy. Life for her will never be the same." Or My New Daddy tells the story of Charles, whose mummy tells him one day that, quote, "Nature made a mistake, and she should have been born a boy like Charlie." Quote, "Daddy," aka mummy, "goes to a doctor and has an operation. Charles now has a new daddy who loves him, and he loves his daddy." End quote. Well, there could be no surer way of confusing little children. This fairy tale version of what it's like to have a parent transition bears absolutely zero relation to the sad reality. And then, of course, for teenagers, the brave new world of gender fluidity brings a whole new dimension to the confusing area of forming relationships. If you start going out with somebody, is he really a boy? Will he stay a boy? Will he become a girl? Who knows? No one knows. And then children are harmed because they're being pushed back into regressive stereotypes. We should be challenging regressive stereotypes and helping every young person and every child achieve their own potential, whatever their own aptitudes. But many of the books for children promoted by transgender lobby organisations reinforce stereotypes. So, a book called Can I Tell You About Gender Diversity describes a little girl called Kit, who explains, quote, "I didn't like playing with dolls or wearing dresses, and I hated having long hair. Well, clearly, this little boy must really be a boy. This little girl must really be a boy." And then the well-loved story Cinderella has been rewritten for little ones with a sinister twist. Jamie, a Cinderella fairy story, Jamie, a transgender Cinderella story, pictures Jamie, who's a little girl, but she is great at fixing things. So she realises, of course, that she must be a boy. Jamie manages to get to the ball dressed as a boy with a great new haircut and dances with the princess, and they fall in love and leave the ball in the pumpkin car that Jamie has been clever enough to make, and they live happily ever after. Or the book I Am Jazz. Jazz, a little boy, announces, quote, "For as long as I can remember, my favourite colour was pink," as if that explains the need to change sex. Moreover, these books given to children introduce and then reinforce this false category of cisgender, because it's inferred that cis means a willingness to conform to those old sexist stereotypes. Boring, conformist, conforming to stereotypes. Who wants to be like that? Who wants to be cis? And then as puberty hits, all too often, exposure to porn cements horrific sexualized images of so-called real men and real women. The vile and ubiquitous porn industry portrays women as being horribly and violently abused, and it portrays true femininity as over-sexualized, ever available for that abuse. And in that sort of culture, what girl would want to grow up to be a woman? In Irreversible Damage, Abigail Schreier describes how after many conversations with teen girls, she found a common theme. She wrote, quote, "They flee womanhood like a house on fire, their minds fixed on escape, not on any particular destination. A common response is, I don't know exactly that I want to be a guy, I just know that I don't want to be a girl," end quote. And then, of course, masculinity is presented as toxic. Men are the oppressors. In such a culture, what boy would want to grow up to be a man? One dad, describing himself as a gender-critical dad, writes, quote, "Trans activism is a form of bullying. If you're not a porn culture straight, a proper boy's boy or girly girl, you must be defective, in need of fixing by reclassification, drugs, or a scalpel." And then briefly, children are being denied the right, aren't they, to privacy and safety. Stephanie Davis-Sarai and Susan Matthews write, insisting on mixed-sex toilets, changing rooms, sleeping accommodation, denies children their right to privacy from the opposite sex. It puts girls at risk and undermines basic safeguarding. So, I'm sorry, but we're hearing of girls who actually avoid going to the toilet while they're at school. They're reluctant to use facilities they might be sharing with boys. That's a health risk. Other girls have to compete against biological males in contact sports. That's a safety risk. But how should we respond to all of this? A false ideology has captured our schools, professions, medicine, psychiatry, even some of the church. We should be thankful for and support organisations such as the Family Education Trust. I work for the Christian Institute. There are other concerned groups who are willing to call out the lies. Concerned parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, concerned citizens need to rise up and say, enough is enough. By all means, respect the dignity and safety of trans people, protect them from wrongful attacks, but leave our kids alone. We must respect the dignity and safety of children and young people. We must respect the vulnerability of children, protect them from the indoctrination of activists and the poison effect of online influencers, protect them from harmful, untested, irreversible medical and hormonal interventions. We must respect the rightful authority and role of parents. We must campaign where necessary against activists going into schools, against the proposed conversion therapy ban applying to trans issues, which could lead to parents being criminalised for teaching their own children about the risks and dangers of transition. Campaign, if necessary, for that High Court ruling in the case of Keira Bell to be upheld and applied. But above all, we must tell the truth. We must refuse to tell lies. We must be informed so that we can challenge the endless false statistics about, for example, suicides, hate crimes, murders. Disagreement is not hatred. Real care and compassion have to be based on truth. Of course, respect and kindness can be shown to individuals with whom we disagree, but don't tell lies, and especially don't tell children lies. It's impossible to really change sex. A trans man is not a biological woman or vice versa. Boys are boys, girls are girls. I've mentioned the symposium, Transgender Children Born in Your Own Body, and the contributors all challenge the trend towards affirming the desire of some children to change sex, and the editors summarise their conclusions. I quote, "Transgendering children is not progressive. It's politically reactionary, medically dangerous, and abuse of children. We look back in horror, don't we, at some of the medical practices of the past, lobotomies, the use of mercury, if you please, to cure all ailments, routine removal of all teeth in the vain effort to prevent infection. But future generations will look back and marvel at the wholesale abuse of children performed in the name of a false ideology. And too many people know in their hearts that this is wrong, but they turn the other way, terrified of the consequences of taking a stand. And children and young people are paying the price for society's collective cowardice and fear. So thank you, Family Education Trust, for standing for truth, and please continue to stand up for the real rights of children, protect them from lies, teach them the truth. Thank you.